And then verse 15, it says, therefore. So, I mean, look at Christ's logic. He was speaking to them. Okay? He was speaking to them and he was answering their question. Let's go back to what their question was. They said, tell us, Christ, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay, so it's clear. It's clear. It's very clear. And you have to also throw in, I didn't throw this in, but you really have to include into this period of time, chapter 24, verse 2, basically, where Christ is saying, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. And that's what prompted them, the disciples, to say, well, when are these things going to happen? Tell us when these things will be. So he had started what was going to happen by talking about that. So you got to include that into the period of time in the beginnings of sorrow. Okay, and going back to verse 15, it says, so when the period of time fulfills all of these things, okay, within that period of time called the beginnings of sorrow, the beginning of sorrows, and all these things are fulfilled, and then the end will come, he says, as a result of that, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, and we just learned, okay, what abomination is to God. There's so many things that are abominations to God, but there's some pretty severe ones that cause him to say, okay, enough is enough. I'm sending an army, okay, a Gentile army, to go and make sure that you understand that I am your God and I'm going to punish you. So just keep that in mind. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, okay, so that makes desolate, something that causes desolation on the land, an abomination that causes desolation of the land, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. It's then, after the beginnings of sorrow, after the period of the beginning of sorrows, when the end starts, and you see the abomination of desolation, that is when whoever is in Judea flees to the mountains. And these are very, 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 very severe days. As it says in verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation. Okay, so this is the basically what Christ's logic here says, that great tribulation comes during the period of that's known as the end, not the period that is known as the beginning of sorrows. Such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time. No, nor ever shall be. Sounds like Jacob's trouble, because that's intense. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. Sound incredibly intense. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And during this time of the end, read in 23, it says, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So during this time of that's called the end, after the beginning of sorrows, there is false Christs and false prophets that rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out, or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For, here, check this out. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. So don't believe anything that people are saying out there. whether it's staged or not, whether it's a so-called alien invasion, whether it's people actually just using technology to try to fool people through whatever technology is available. Because Christ made it very clear. He said, "For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." Okay, for wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, okay, during that end period, so immediately after this tribulation, the sun will be darkened. No man can do that. And the moon will not give its light. No man can do that. The stars will fall from heaven. You'll know when these things are happening. And the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Sounds like a lot of what's described in Revelation. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So all of this, which happens during the end period here, sounds like a lot of what happens in Revelation, where throughout Revelation it talks about all these vials and all these various plagues and all these horrific things that are occurring and causing a lot of people to be under a lot of stress and a lot of duress, and are doing things that they would normally not do, and who claim that they love Christ and love God and are betraying others, and others are being killed. And even, think about the duress, think about the stress, think about the pressure, think about the evil, think about the wickedness. If you think that this kind of environment could not cause people to say, we're going to sacrifice to demons. They may not say demons, but we're going to sacrifice our sons and our daughters because they've gone crazy out of their sheer wickedness and evil and absolute just what God allows them. It's a delusion, because God allows delusion to come to them. And God can do that. Do you not think that in the past, as we read, when they were doing that, they were not delusional? Do you think God didn't see that? Do you think God was like, oh no, I'd better intervene and stop them from sacrificing their sons and their daughters? No, he allowed it to happen to prove a point of how evil and vile human beings can become if they turn their backs away from him. And you think that under this kind of environment, when it's such duress and stress, you think that they're not going to be able to do that again and cause something so abominable in the sight of God, so abominable that it causes a desolation of the land, and then ultimately leads to, thankfully, his final intervention where all of this occurs and Christ comes, reigning in great power, ready with the sword to kill and to destroy for righteousness' sake. This aligns very perfectly during a time that is very full of distress and full of such incredible signs, magnitude of signs that makes people's heart fail on them. And they go pale, as it says in Revelations. And it just absolutely looks so much like it, because he talks about signs in heaven, just like it does in Revelation. And it would be so intense. Just look at verse 31. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. Throughout Revelation, you constantly hear about these angels sounding trumpets. And they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Why? Because it's intense. He gathers them because he wants them. In other verses, it talks about how he gathers them up to meet him in the air, and that they actually do fight and allows them to fight during this end time that is described here and is elaborated on in Revelation. I mean, we're talking about great signs and signs in heaven. We're talking about great tribulation. We're talking about things that we see are elaborated on in far more detail in Revelation. And that's how the Bible works. God puts a little here and a little there. Through one messenger, through one prophet, he'll start talking about certain things. And then through, hundreds of years later or centuries later, he'll send another one of his prophets and he'll elaborate on it through other messages. And you can go to Mark 13 and read, and he reads almost verbatim to what Matthew recorded. And think of the chronology of it. Think of it how Christ clearly talks about a period called the beginning of sorrows, which is described by this, the other, and he describes that. He says, but that's not the end yet. Then he says, then it's the end, and at that point, you're going to have tribulation. You're going to have signs, the sun being darkened. The heavens will be shaken. And then at some point, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Okay, so think of the chronology of these things. These things seem to happen, thankfully, very quickly, because like he said, because it's so intense, they have to happen in a short period of time, but by God's mercy, he would not allow it to drag on because they get so intense. He says that if I did not cut these days short, then the very elect, for their sake, they would be deceived and they would possibly fall and recant. They would possibly stumble. They would possibly, reject God. And he doesn't want that. So there's a period of time coming where Christ very clearly in the Gospels, you can harmonize it, said, it's a period of time called the beginning of sorrows. You're going to see all of these signs, and then the end will come. And when the end comes, there's going to be great tribulation, and you're going to see the abomination of desolation, and then you're going to see the signs from heaven. But I'm going to make those days short, because if not, then trust me, it's going to be so intense, you will not want to live those days for that long at all, because the power of the signs of these false prophets and false Christs is going to be so crazy that you're just going to start to believe them. That's what he's saying. You're going to believe them almost. If it were not for me saying, you know what, enough is enough, I'm going to cut these days short. Thank God he cuts them short. So we're not there yet, because these days are a period of time. A period of time where he says these things are going to happen, but I'm going to cut them short, because you're going to see things that are just going to be so unbelievable. You're going to think that it's coming from me, says God, but they're not. But because there's such great signs and great wonders, you're going to just want to believe that. But I'm going to cut them. I'm going to cut them short. I'm going to make it short for your sake. And there's going to be intense. It's an intense period of time, and it's very short. Thank God it's very short. And definitely harmonize the Gospels. Go and study how he also wrote in Luke 21 about these same events. And he adds little subtle details to make the differences for us to understand. Like Luke 21 verse 9 says, but when you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately. Okay, so it kind of says, it sounds like it says that there's going to be a period of time that drags on where you're going to see the beginning of sorrows. So we could possibly be in that time right now. So we could possibly be, again, we'd have to be at a period of time where I could just simply know what's going on across the world, anywhere, to see these things happening. And it sounds like he says here, it's very clear, he says, but the end will not come immediately. He didn't use the word immediately prior in the other two Gospels and the other two. So here he says not immediately. So it sounds like the beginning of sorrows period drags on for a bit. And then at some point, when the end does come, he says, I have to cut that short because it's just too intense. Verse 12 says, but before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute, delivering up to the synagogues and prisons. Interesting because he keeps saying synagogues. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, but it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. Think of Stephen the deacon. That's how powerful your testimony will be because of God's Spirit. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends. See, that wasn't in the other two. And they will put some of you to death. It's an intense period. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair on your head shall be lost. By your patience possess your souls. Okay, so there's a period of time, beginning of sorrows, which are, he doesn't even use the word beginning of sorrows here. He uses it in Mark and Matthew, but we know it's there, it exists. That's why you have to harmonize it. And then here in verse 20 he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Whoa. Hold on a sec. You're saying that the desolation has to do with Jerusalem? Well, didn't we prove all this time that whenever God talks about desolation, he's talking about cities, he's talking about heights, he's talking about the land? We proved that. So he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Its, as in Jerusalem's desolation, is near. Wow. Then let those, see, he added something here that wasn't in the other two. So, wow. See, here he doesn't even mention the abomination of desolation. He basically tells us what that desolation is. He says it's when armies surround Jerusalem and are about to desolate it and make it into a wasteland. Why? What is that abomination that causes that kind of desolation? Remember, think of it. This is a very, very intense period of time. Incredibly intense. You can't even imagine what it would be like. But try. Think COVID, lockdown. People were stressed. People were angst. People were angry. People were doing things that they would normally not do. And even since then, people have started acting differently. Do you think that the abomination that would lead to this would not be something so grave as sacrificing sons and daughters? Think about it. There's all kinds of things, signs and wonders, and there's armies approaching, and you're in Jerusalem, and you're like, what's going on here? God, help us. But there's no help. God isn't doing it because he's allowing this to happen. And those who believe in Christ are being taken to synagogues and are being killed. And parents are being put under pressure, to deliver their sons and their daughters because, what's going on here? We know who you are. We know who you belong to and who you're a family member of. And we know that they believe in Christ and we want you to deliver them to us or we're going to kill you. And so your parents are like, they either will deliver you up or they're going to get killed. I don't know what your parents are going to do. I don't know what your brothers are going to do. I don't know what your sisters are going to do. But this is the environment in which Christ is saying, things are going to get so intense. Think about the pressure. Think about the duress. Think about your life is at stake. And you think at some point, and there's armies coming too, to Jerusalem, and there's wars everywhere, and things are, pretty chaotic. This is a chaotic scene. There's great signs and great wonders. There's earthquakes everywhere. There's, great things happening that are just shocking people. And you think at some point they're not going to be like, well, God isn't answering. So like they did in the past, God isn't answering. God gives them delusion and they start burning sons and daughters. You think it's impossible? It's there for us to understand that this is more than possible. It's historically documented as having happened. So, brothers and sisters, I've done the very best that I could, loyally and faithfully going to the scriptures and the scriptures alone, okay, to understand two very critical concepts and the definitions of two things. One, what does God consider abominations? We saw how he considers many things abominations, many things. But we also saw that the main thing that caused him to intervene on a set of people, and in this case, historically, on the people of the tribes of Israel, was the fact that they got to a point of such vile wickedness that they decided to turn their back on God so bad that they sacrificed, seeking favor, of course, to demons. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters. They were trying to appease to another god, to demons, as it says that we saw in the scriptures, to gain favor of some sort, to somehow gain some kind of wisdom about something about their lives, about how to, King Ahaz, how to rule better the people, King Manasseh, how to basically do this and that. Why else would they appease and try to appease these false gods? So here, bring me my sons and bring me daughters, bring me your sons, bring me your daughters, throw them through the fire. And if they're kings, you think they don't have that power? And God said, okay, this is an abomination that requires intervention because this is enough. And so twice he showed us that as a result of it getting to that degree, he went and he sent a Gentile army to make sure that they were done. And we learned that desolation is talking very clearly about the land. And we learned in the Gospels, and it confirmed it in the Gospels, that when we hear about the abomination of desolation that's spoken of by Daniel, that it talks about armies surrounding Jerusalem to make that place desolate. So watch for these things. But more importantly, prepare for these things. And get spiritually close to God, and don't turn your back at all whatsoever. And question, are you a true Christian? Because apparently there's going to be a time that is so intense within that period of time called the beginning of sorrows, leading up to the end, which we saw very clearly. Christ says there's two different periods. Don't get them confused. Don't get them twisted. But during that time, there's going to be some who are so-called call on my name and are going to betray you. What side are you on? Make sure you're on the side of God. Now, how are you going to do that? You have to examine yourselves. You have to prove through the scriptures that you are true. And you have to cry to God on your knees and go prostrate. Go full like Moses did. And go prostrate. If you don't know what that means, it means go flat on your face. And do it in private. Do it in private. Don't do it like other religious leaders who show that, in a display of what? Are their prayers answered? Are your prayers answered? Because those who please God have their prayers answered. It might take some time, but it happens. Examine yourselves. Go to the scriptures. Learn from the scriptures. Ask God to open up your eyes about the scriptures. Don't go about and check, theological readings, or sorry, theological, you know, commentaries about the scriptures. Go and let this legal document define itself by the glossary of terms that it has, as I have shown you. Take that example as I have shown you. There's others who also do it, and see what it does to you. There's apps that you can use where you can just basically put in all the various words and then collect all the different scriptures that talk about that particular word and ask God to lead you to understand what in the world that means. Go and do one on love. Look up the word love everywhere, including the Old Testament, and see that the Old Testament proves that it describes a very loving God, that describes very, very intricately what is to be done and how we are to behave and how we are to respond to everyday life situations. Except now in modern times, we have to apply that in modern times, but there's no difference other than we're using different means of living on a daily basis, and it requires God's Spirit to help us discern how to be the best possible Christian, Christ-like, God-pleasing, God-fearing human being. So please go to the scriptures, know and understand that you have to be able to see certain things because God says that you will, and that there's a period of time that is coming that is going to be very intense. So I hope and pray that you're ready for it, because when else would we know that these things are happening around us in the world unless we had these little devices and we had various other media outlets, not just one or two, but others who are trying their best to report on the ground of different things occurring in this world that mainstream media will not, because they have, their own, obviously their own bias and their own agenda, which they have to fulfill in order to get paid. Okay, so when else is that time when, by a fair God, he'd say, you're going to see these things if you're looking. And if you're looking, these are the things to look for. And he gives us a list. When else? May God bless you all. May God give you strength. And may he open any part of your mind to understand whatever needs to be understood as soon as possible, so that you can glorify him and be ready for when all of these things occur, and be in that group of people who give a testimony that goes across the world because you are imprisoned, okay, to preach this gospel, said Christ, at that time, nothing else, at that time, during that time, because that's exactly what's going to happen. And think Stephen the deacon as your example, okay? And you're not going to have to premeditate on anything. Just be close to God and don't even try to premeditate on them. And he will give you the words to speak those wonderful words to basically indict those who are coming against you, okay? And then shortly thereafter, there's going to be such a wonderful period of time, but it's going to get crazy at first. But that millennial rule with Christ and a peaceful time is what comes after that. And you have to have that vision. Without that vision, you will not understand. Without that vision, you will perish without the understanding. May you not be one of those who are killed, but if you are, keep that vision, keep that hope, and know and understand that you will be in that beautiful millennial role and rule with whatever role that God wants you to have alongside Christ. It's a promise. Don't ever forget that. It's a promise. I pray these things for you. I pray these things for us. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.